Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. All of you are very welcome at the third session of the spring series of Forum in Literary Studies, which is organized, as Dalibor already said, by the Institute of the Czech Literature of the Czech Academy of Sciences. We dedicated current series to the culture descent in East Central Europe before 1989 and new issues in this field of this research. We decided to introduce you interesting research outputs of our colleagues from the European Cost Action New Exploratory Phase in research on East European cultures of descent, as well as from the Czech Intercost project Media of Culture Opposition in Czechoslovakia. Today, we are going to continue with the second part of the Cold War print cultures talks, which kindly prepared for us Dr. Jessie Labov and Dr. Piotr Wciślik. So a special welcome to our guest speakers, Jessie and Piotr. We'll follow the same model for the session as last time, the interview about the recent book, and if you join us on Meet platform, you can also enter into the discussion during or later. And now, Jessie Labov, the Vice Chair of the NEP for Descent Action, is a resident fellow in the Center for Media, Data and Society and Research in the Literary Theory Department at the Institute of Literary Studies at the Ed Vosch-Laurent Research Network. At Central European University, she worked as a member for the Digital Humanities Initiative and the Text Analysis Across Disciplines Initiative. She has also worked on a variety of digital humanities projects, and she is a co-editor of the book called Samizdat, Tamizdat and Beyond, Transnational Media During and After Socialism. And during today's interview, we will get to know more about her most recent book project, which is named Transatlantic Central Europe, Contesting Geography and Redefining Culture Beyond the Nation. And on the other side, the curious interview who will ask Jessie all the questions about the book and her research interests is Piotr Wciślik, Assistant Professor and Deputy Director of the Digital Humanities Center at the Institute of Literary Research of the Polish Academy of Sciences. He has published on the history of dissident political thought and dissident media, and is currently developing a data-driven approach in that area. And this year he will publish a book named Dissident Legacies of Samizdat Social Media Activism, Unlicensed Print Culture in Poland 1976 to 1990s. I hope you will enjoy the discussion, and Jessie and Piotr, thank you for coming. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Petra. We'll be talking about the book Transatlantic Central Europe, Contesting Geography and Redefining Culture Beyond the Nation, and we'll hear that from the ARC, Transatlantic Central European, which Jessie Labov is. Before we begin, I just wanted to remind you quickly about the format when Petra asked us to do lectures separately. We just thought with Jessie that we have never made time to read each other's book. So I would now like to thank Petra very much for giving me this opportunity to read, to have time, to make time to read Jessie's book, which was a great experience, and this discussion will be all about it. So let me start with the first part of your book, which is dedicated to the journal Cross Currents, edited by the Czech linguist Matejka. And about Cross Currents, you see it as the embodiment of this project of Central Europe that is kind of brewing in transnational networks, in transatlantic networks. in the 80s. And when you speak about it, you foreground this correspondence between form and content. And by form, you mean the format of the political cultural journal, the samizdat system, the literary tradition of an essay, and encyclopedies, which I think is the most interesting observation here. But I would like us to focus first on the content. And by content, you mean the agenda inscribed in the subtitle of your book, right? The Contesting Geography and Redefining Culture Beyond the Nation. So one way in which you define the cross-currents agenda is liberal humanism. And obviously what comes to mind to a Cold War intellectual historian is socialist humanism, of course. So I would like to tease you to think about liberal humanism as we think about, socialist humanism. And there are three aspects that I will mention, but you can just refer to any of them. I mean, whatever fits. So first, we understand socialist humanism as a constructive critique of the actually existing socialism. So this is the humanizing part, the humanizing relationship with respect to broader socialist project. So was there anything about contemporary liberalism that the Cross Currents project wanted to humanize? In other words, is there some constructive critique of the post-war liberalism that this legacy involves? So that's one thing. And then socialist humanism can be also identified as a swan song of socialism, that comes to prominence when the broader socialist project starts degenerating, starts its fall. So how does cross-current projects relate to post-communist neoliberalism that came after '89? In this sense, can it tell us something about this moment of crisis of liberalism that we are facing today? And then, speaking about geography and contesting geography, socialist humanism itself was a concept which had a contested geography. So first you have the new left thinkers in the West, which define socialist humanism as Western Marxism, right? Mm-hmm. They say that the Western Marxist tradition was a humanist, culturist tradition which degenerated as it went east. And then you have some Central European authors such as Andrzej Walicki in case of Poland, which defend socialist humanism as a regional product of Central Europe, like with questions why we should treat George Lukács as a Western Marxist, right? So is it important for the Cross Currents project to identify their liberal humanism as something kind of local or regional, or did they consider it kind of a plug-in into a universal tradition? So that's my first question.
Starting with the last one, yes, the latter, universal. I think there is nothing geographically specific about their humanism to start with, but I'm going to back up a few steps and just talk about how geographically bizarre it is to try to explain this Western-based concept of Central Europe in this context, here on this side of the Atlantic, to people for whom Central Europe is simply a layer of identity and not some kind of a foreign concept. And it's a challenge I haven't really figured out how to address, how to present the book here. Because if you can imagine, I was explaining all of these concepts to people in North America, for whom the whole idea of Central Europe was quite an exotic, distant place. Not well defined, not just because the borders are loose, but not well defined because they weren't even quite sure which part of Europe we were talking about. It was just simply a part of Europe that was not instantly recognizable to their concept of Europe because the names weren't familiar and they had more diacritics. So just to start with, when I was introducing this project of Cross Currents, the reason I decided to ground it in this journal was to make it very clear to everybody that it was a Western-based and I would even say an emigre-based phenomenon. Okay, that's just to say, geographically to place it, but also conceptually. Therefore, to try to answer your question, which is much too complex for a first question, we could have just started with what is Central Europe or something easy, but we can start with this and really get into it. What relationship is there between the kind of liberal humanism that was, I would say, proposed by people like Matejka, by Miłosz specifically, by Adam Zagajewski, may he rest in peace, we just lost him, certainly by Kundera. So these are the big figures in it, but also even by Danilo Kish, who's another figure in the book who's very, very prominent. What they were doing, I would call, was a very post-68 retreat into the cultural sphere from a socialist humanist critique. So they, I think, were trying very hard not to engage with the critique of actually existing socialism, and instead turn their whole focus into, as you point out, a critique of liberalism as it existed in the West. And what was their critique? If you read Miłosz from this era, he's very cranky, he's mostly concerned with the materialism of the West, in similar ways that Havel was in his writing in the late 70s. He's concerned with what we now call neoliberalism, sort of the free market Keynesian version of liberalism, and what it loses. And I would say that Matejka, in putting together this cultural construction to try to define the region, was very much looking for an identity beyond 68, so that people would think of something beyond the protests of 68 when they thought about this region. And one more aspect of it, since you asked me very directly, what does it have to do with the sort of neoliberal critique of the critique of neoliberalism in the post-socialist era? Well, I'll put it as simply as I can. It's a very long trajectory in the book. It takes 4 chapters. But what I see happening is that there was a very dedicated attempt to locate a space for liberalism, which included this humanistic element in the 1980s in this project. And I could talk about different aspects of it if you like, but that was, a large project. And the concepts of ethnic coexistence, of multicultural roots to every Central European culture, and therefore a whole which was greater than the sum of its parts. Not necessarily just a kind of a Habsburg idea, but a much broader one, was key. And so what I try to show is that when that idea fell apart in the early 90s, not just because of simply each nation state going its own way, but specifically because of the breakup of Yugoslavia, when that idea was lost, many other pieces of that concept of liberal humanism were lost. And I do think that could be traced more broadly in the region in the post-socialist era. And as a result, something I sometimes call a bundle of humanisms that included the free market and human rights and all these kind of multicultural ideals, that dropped out, and we were left with a kind of a free market version of it. So that's that's my answer in the 90s. So I hope that tried to address your question. I don't know if it told anybody anything about Michigan, but maybe some transatlantic space.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's good. It's a great answer, and I think this is like one of the reasons why the legacy is worth rethinking and returning to today. But and I will just I'm posing this extensive question so that our audience can get a sense of a kind of lecture, anyhow, in the sense of presenting your arguments. And now for the second question, we're going to talk about your concept of the workaround, which is, I think, one of the most interesting concepts in the book. And I like it a lot because it's a very generative in the way it brings together the very different contexts that are crucial for the samizdat system, which you discuss further in the second part of your book. So And it's also, I think, where our two, narratives achieve the most synergy. So you have three understandings as I kind of came up from reading your book and of the workaround. And then, so first you define it, and this is the moment when you actually define it. So this is a quotation: a set of steps used to compensate or avoid dealing with the problem rather than fixing it. So that's the first definition of the workaround. And then you refer to technological contexts where such temporal fixes exist, which outlive their purposes, and sometimes they create vulnerabilities, like when you construct a temporary bridge over the river because the old bridge was destroyed in war, and then this bridge keeps being there forever, and having to accommodate as more and more traffic. And one cute aspect of this understanding of the work around is I think it's a word that is super from Central Europe, and it taps to a very kind of core of our self-stereotypes as Central Europeans. In Poland, we have this word prowizorka. I'm not sure it exists in Czech, but in Polish there is a word prowizorka for this provisional solution. And we like to say in Poland that there is nothing as durable as the prowizorka. And it's kind of part of our kind of national characterology that we don't get things done. We leave them half-baked. And I think there is a similar thing like this in Hungary, but not sure what about the Czech. So that's the first meaning. And then the second is the do-it-yourself aspect, how the need to find a workaround in the communication flow creates incentives for tinkering with accessible means and to find innovative ways to overcome barriers in communications. So that's the second. And the third aspect refers to the content layer or the intellectual history layer rather than the media story layer. And this is how the intellectual tricksters involved in repurposing political language for a different aim than the aim for which they were kind of created, right? So you have the three contexts and three meanings, and then concerning the first and the second meaning, the surrogacy part and the do-it-yourself aspect, I think they are interconnected in a sad way. I think this understanding of a workaround as a surrogate solution is very true. It's very true in the way in which the samizdat system was understood by its own creators, the dissidents, as something surrogate rather than a positive proposition of a new form of alternative media. And in my book, I propose that this burden of surrogacy, which was implied in your concept of the workaround, was why after 89, the samizdat communication culture was basically, put to the dustbin of history. It was discarded, that it was not seen as a legacy that is worth of continuation. So the question is here whether you would agree with that proposition.
Okay. I think we should have an interview about your interview questions, like at another point, because it's so much more thinking than anyone has ever done about this book, including me, honestly. I think I have to tell you how this concept came to be first, and then I'll try to answer your questions. And I tried to write some things in the chat, A, so I could remember what you said, because there was a lot, and B, just so there's a hope that anyone else could follow the way we think. So, as everybody must realize, this book was simply my dissertation, and in the US, there's this horrible thing they make you do, where instead of liberating you to work on something else for your habilitation, they force you to work on your dissertation again, but 60% of it has to be new. Like, how is that a productive move for your post-PhD? It just means you have to revisit your concepts and try desperately to find some way to find them interesting again. And so it was the 1990s. And there was this political disillusionment, which I referred to with liberalism as a failure in the region as I saw it. I wanted to write about the internet, and I wanted to write about the color revolutions, and I wanted to write about, resistance as I saw it in the prison. right? All these cool things that were happening with, actually at that time, open source movements. So I was very distracted from the whole concept. These musty guys, men, all of them, talking about conservative thought and trying to rehabilitate it. And I wanted to talk about kind of the weird and interesting tricks that I saw happening in the present. But then, obviously, it had to be one book. And so I had to figure out what conceptual framework would unite the samizdat system that I was describing in a couple different contexts in the first half of the book, like the dissertation. And then some of these moves, I would call them, or gestures that I was interested in the more contemporary periods, in the post-89 period. And so that's where I started to think about the workaround. And one of the reasons I was very invested in it initially, I wrote a long paper, which I then discarded, about ways to combat path-dependent thinking in the region, especially post-89. So ways to understand social movement and change and cultural movement and change that weren't so path-dependent and weren't always saying, well, when you bring democracy in and civil society in, then this will happen, that will happen, and this will happen. Because clearly that's not what happened. There were many different patterns and many different spirals in different directions. And what I saw instead happening was this tinkering, this making do workaround. That's where the workaround concept comes from. And I borrowed a lot from hacker culture, because what happens with the workaround, as you all know, I think by now from Piotr talking about it, is what was once a bug becomes a feature. So in fixing something, you create something new, which in turn perhaps becomes the focus of your creation. And then that becomes a more efficient and useful loop to travel. So that's where I was going with it. And the contexts that I gave for that were quite diverse, and I won't even try to make sense of them for you because I can barely make sense of them for myself. I won't even talk about Yugoslavia in this context. It's too complex. But I will mention at least sort of in Ukraine and Belarus, the way that some of the techniques of samizdat were transformed in the internet era, and sometimes not with devices like this, but with lower fi devices like Bluetooth jacking, where you're just kind of taking over networks on a very local level. So that's what I got interested in, and thinking about how no matter what the overall, let's say, contextual framework might be, when you have this situation where a text is trying to travel across a border, something like this has to happen. Okay, and just to answer your question, Piotr, if I can try, I'm not sure if I really can answer it, but do I think it was discarded because it was a surrogate system, or do I think it was a generative hybrid form? I definitely think the latter, and I trace all of the new forms of communication in different, let's say, captured environments in the same genealogy. So I'm even talking about in the present in Hungary, the different ways that people find to communicate about what is happening here. I see lots of generative hybrid workarounds to capture of state media, and on the local level and on the transnational level, both. So I think it continues to generate.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember, because the tides have turned, and then we have this tendency now. First we thought that kind of Facebook is the new Agora, and then we now want to kind of forget Facebook and go back to samizdat as one of the op-eds in the New York Times read, because it's all now seems to be as a dystopia, and yet there is a kind of a positive, I would say, a longing, a kind of communitarian aspiration, which is, I think, kind of stronger, and hopefully it will persist. This gloomy moment in which we are. at. I think I will leave aside the third dimension of the concept, like the repurposing and intellectual history concept, because I want you to talk more about the digital humanities layer. I mean, it's you know, it's like a wedding cake. This book, it just has layers over layers, and they are all soaked. So it's a joy it's a treat. So, and Jessie is a very early adopter of digital humanities, and also as a transatlantic Central Europeanist. As she's a spiritus movement of the Slavic digital humanities, which is a group and a platform that integrates scholars that adopt DH methods to study East and Central Europe on both sides of the Atlantic. And in chapter 3, you have a DH-driven study of the geographical footprint of the Polish emigre journal Kultura, which you measured by extracting dates and locations and of authors, letter writers, and funders of the journal. So, like, first, a simple question at last, like, what are the main insights of that study for understanding of Kultura and of the Polish diaspora more broadly?
Oh, okay. That I can do, and quite easily, maybe with a visualization to give us a break from looking at each other. I would just say about the DH project is when you say someone's an early adopter of DH, what it probably means is that they did something very crude quite badly through the least efficient means possible for a very long time. Because what I did in this project with Kultura could probably be done now in about a month, and it took me 4 years. So, like, that's the nature of the practice, and I'm not proud of that. I'm just admitting it, and it's also why the book took 10 years to come out. So it's more, you know, it's just the way it is. That's life as an assistant professor trying to do a DH project with her dissertation. So I'm going to share my screen to try to show you what this DH project really was about, and also so you can see something else. And but more importantly, perhaps, I'll try to explain why I embedded it in the book instead of just writing the book, finishing it, and then going off to do a DH project. That's where I really feel like I have an intervention to make, not in the project itself. So here we go. Let's try to make this slick, okay? I'm not sure that's going to happen. So there are many different versions of this project that I could share with you that are online in different spaces. And this is the one I like presenting the most. Let me just get rid of some of these squares, because what you can see here is actually a more interactive form, and then I can present you different views quite easily. Whereas if I were to show you, for example, the maps in the book, which are just dreadful and should never have been published, you wouldn't really learn much. Whereas here I can actually show you what I was trying to do. So the other cool thing about this, which I'm not going to present now, is that you can see how it layers with other projects that happen to be carried out simply at the same institute at the same time, that have nothing to do with mine. So I'll close those for now. But these, what you can see up here, is it big enough? Should I try to make the screen bigger, or can you see something? Can you see
a bit bigger.
Bit bigger? That's what I thought. You always got to ask. Let's try that. We'll just zoom in a bit. There we go. Over here, these are all of the authors of Kultura in the entire period from 47 to 89. Bam! Here are the people that wrote letters into Kultura from all over the world. Here, and funders. And even those that were rejected in a shorter period. This is just from the 70s. And yet most of those are in the middle of the US, actually. But not all. Some are in Europe as well. Now, you can't see anything in this map now, I know that. But that's what's in here. And why did I want to do this? What I was asking, the big research question behind this project was not just who wrote in Kultura, because we kind of knew that, right? We read it and it was discussed a lot already at the time, but what the reception history was and how we might understand the sort of circulation of the texts in it, who was engaging with it and why. And so what I can show you in dynamic form a little bit by using these filters here, and I'll try to do this quickly, is how this changes over time. And I think I need to get just a slightly different view of the world to make sure that we have Australia, which plays a key role. And especially movements now. That's as wide as I can get. Okay. Well, I'll just maybe do this hemisphere and then the other one. So the authors are pretty much where you expect. They start out a little bit dispersed, but then in the 50s, they consolidate pretty much in Europe. I'll try to give you that view. That's not that interesting. We only put that there to show you that, you know, you can see them all. But then when you look at the other categories, not just the people who were featured in the journal, but the people that were communicating with it in one way or another, you can see different patterns. So we start here in, again, mostly places you'd expect with a few outliers. But then what happens is, and I need to show you North America so you can really see this. I think it's the background layer is pushing through. But I hope you can see it well enough. You can see a lot more engagement on the margins of the diaspora. Trust me, this is Australia down here. And trust me, this is North America over here. Until we get into the 70s and the 80s, when it becomes very much a conversation happening between these outlying areas and the current. I think I see what's happening. And so these are showing up as actual layers. And then with the funders, I tell an even broader story, which I'm not going to go into now in detail, but just to show you the last two layers of funders. What we see are some very, very active hotspots in some very diverse places, including, for example, the west coast of the US. So that's enough for you to see what I was trying to do in the project. I can stop sharing and now talk to you like a person. But I think at least like clicking on these buttons and allowing you to see these symbols pop up gives you an idea of what we might explore quantitatively that actually has a lot of historical and geographic meaning for us. And that's what I was trying to get at in the project as a whole, that in order to read these maps, you have to know the history of the Polish immigration. You have to know the history of Kultura, why different periods had a different pattern, what caused those relationships with the journal to change. For example, let's say in and the post-56 period, when a couple of authors of Kultura moved back to Poland and started writing from there and engaged a public that was in Poland, it really angered a lot of people in the diaspora that were convinced they didn't want anything to do with socialist Poland. And so the letter writers lit up all over the globe. That's an example. So obviously the solidarity era brought a different wave of responses and a much more engaged response from the diaspora than anyone ever expected. But lastly, I'll just explain what I was doing putting it in this book, which I frankly never thought anybody would read, but I thought if they did, then, well, there should be some maps in there to express a different modality of writing about the region. Not here are where the borders of Central Europe are, but here are where the traces of the meaning of the region lie. And that's a global phenomenon. And that I think is the bigger point, that with DH, you can make bigger arguments than you can with qualitative work because you can bring a bigger scale into it. So all of these essays I was writing about in the first half of the book that are basically published in one journal in one place were the qualitative me reading them from beginning to end with very little of a quantitative view. And I could address around 45 individual authors' work and maybe another small salon's worth of people responding to it. But with this DH project, I could actually reach a sociological dimension that I really wanted to get at as to the meaning of this kind of circulation of texts for a wider public. And that's what I wanted to illustrate, and that's why I stuck it in the book, even though those little black and white maps in this book are just useless.
Okay, yeah, well, it's just, you know, coming back from the concept of workaround, you should not kind of despise the means that are at your disposal at the particular place and time to make your point. So I think the maps are all right as they I only want to comment that it's also a very interesting way of embedding digital humanities research, because we always, like, if you look from the inside of the digital humanities community, you have this boundary work around the concept of close and distant reading, and which like to delimit kind of the boundaries of the fields. You have this discussion with these two concepts being in opposition, but I think it kind of like your book is a living proof that actually the two approaches are complementary, and as the DH field matures, we should get rid of that antiquated debate. But I don't want you to react to that. Instead, I think we have 10 minutes more before we go into a round of questions. So I would like this probably to be my last question for you, and it's about post-colonialism. In chapter 2, you focus on the debate about Central Europe in the 80s. And you unearthed a little-known episode, which happened during the International Writers' Conference in Lisbon in '88. So, can you tell us why that event has attracted your attention, and in particular on the link between Central Europe and Central Europe project and post-colonialist project, as you see it in the book?
Okay, I can do that in just a few minutes. And it's very biographical again. Autobiographical, intellectually biographical, and hopefully sociologically too. What's funny about it, I mean, I find it funny, is that I was very engaged in this concept, this question. I was wrestling with it in the 1990s deeply, and I'll tell you why in a second. And then in the 2000s, it came up again, like, okay, let's see if we can call it Eastern Europe post-colonial. And then in the 2010s, it came up again. Can we use the tools of post-colonial theory to learn something new about the region? I don't think it'll ever die. I think we'll just keep asking that question in different ways. Now, perhaps we might be asking it by sometimes applying some of these transnational or global models of cultural production to the region. But at the 1990s, it had this term. Okay, so I went to New York University, small place at the time in the 1990s, and I was in the Department of Comparative Literature, which was mostly a school of post-colonial theory. And I had the most amazing privilege, I didn't know it at the time, that half of my faculty were not just post-colonial theorists, but actually post-colonial figures. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Nigerian novelist, Kamau Brathwaite, is a woman named Fawzia Mustafa, who ended up being one of the founders of the post-Saidian response to all kinds of critiques of post-colonial theory that came up in the 2000s. But I was just lucky because I happened to be there. That's the autobiographical part. I think any comparative literature department would have had some dimension of post-colonial theory at this time, but it was like, what we were brought up on, and it was the foundation for everything. It's why we read deconstruction again. It's why we read Western Marxism again. And it really is how I came to understand everything about the region. Not because I was so revolutionary, but because I didn't have a choice. That was how I came to look at it. So to answer Piotr's question, that's just a bit of background. I also happened to notice through, again, the biographies of my dissertation parents. Irena Grudzinska-Gross is one, and Jan Gross is another. But other parents, Evangelos Kolotakis, who's a dear friend who's in Greek studies and working very much on the post-colonial work in Greece, that all of these people had befriended at one time or another people associated with the post-colonial canon. And that was not a complete coincidence. That's because they came to academic centers in the West at around the same time, for different reasons. Okay, so skipping ahead, here I am reading Crosscurrents and noticing that as the 80s progress, and as the conversation about Central Europe progress, more and more terms from the, let's say, discourse of post-colonial theory appear. So instead of saying it was a pluralist city, people would say it was a multicultural city. And then instead of saying it was a multicultural poem, or let's say cultural product, they would say it was a hybrid poem. And then people started talking about hybridity, especially to do with cities like Vilnius, where in the early 1980s, they would have said it was just a pluralist place. And so just in various ways, the words subaltern, other, these words started to appear. And I was wondering where this discourse was coming from and why there was this layering. And one of the major sites I found for this was a conversation that happened in 1988. Just an example of it, but also a generative moment. In Lisbon, it was one of a series of writers' conferences where, I guess as a kind of a Western liberal experiment, writers from Central Europe were brought together with writers from all over the southern half of Central America and the northern half of South America to have conversations about what it meant to be a writer. And what erupted was amazing debates about the role of Russian culture in Central Europe. And since Russians were there as well, they were accused of being imperial in a way that they had never experienced before. Not just by these writers from the Caribbean, but also by Susan Sontag, for example, and also the Central Europeanists themselves. And I found it an amazing moment, which happened politically in a different register here in this region, but happened in this cultural discursive register because of the biographical coincidence of these figures coming together. And of course, some theoretical similarities in the way that these, let's say, writers express themselves. So that's why I got so interested in the Lisbon conference, and that's how I finally was able to answer the question, for me, what did the two discourses have to do with each other? It's a biographical coincidence, in a sense, which is not a historical coincidence.
Okay, lovely. Yeah, I mean, I think it's what is fresh about your account of it, that it's meticulously historicizing this debate, whereas I have, well, to share an autobiographical detail, my first kind of contact with application of post-colonial theory, to Polish realities when I was a student. It was like 2005 or something, or 4. And I was kind of helping with the conference, and there was Eva Thompson, who is at Austin, Texas, and she was kind of, and Eva Thompson is a very conservative intellectual who is kind of using, who has this play, which is a very Gombrowicz, at using critical concepts coming from a more or less, like kind of left-wing oriented scholars to deploy it against Polish liberal elites, showing how they are kind of post-colonial, meaning they are subaltern. They continue to be subaltern to Russia. So I pretty much like that you show in this chapter that there is a word beyond that, and this epigonic way of using it is not the only way in which you can use that concept. I mean, we have 4 minutes more, so like the last short question before we open up for others. So I wanted to ask, because the book has 2 dedications. One is to Ladislav Matejka, of course, but then the other one is Jonathan Schell, and I wanted to ask you about Jonathan Schell because first it might not ring a bell to everyone, and then but there is a second part. Again, I have this bias as intellectual historian of dissent. So Jonathan Schell is probably most widely known. I know you're not using it for that, but he's most widely known as this kind of disarmament activist or kind of supporter, and this was always like the disarmament movement in the West was very much suspicious for the Central Europeans in the East. But I know that you probably used the other, like his other book, the Unconquerable World, when I think he brings together, you know, like all the US and the Central European dissidents on one in one layer. So yeah, so just like in 2 minutes, that please tell us something why Jonathan Shell is important for this book.
There is an intellectual answer, but it's a very personal answer. It's because he was the partner of Irena, and he passed away as I was finishing the book, and it was only the last 5 years of his life that I got to know him well, and quite well. But he's the one that helped me understand how to handle the death of my inner liberal. So, you know, those performances I was giving in the 2010s, it was after he passed. No, it was actually not after he passed. It was in the midst of it, as he was passing, where I was very actively trying to recuperate what there was in these discourses of the 1980s about liberalism that was lost. At first, I thought I had just become disenchanted with the whole project because of the neoliberal tendencies that took over and the kind of abandonment of many of the deeper values that had been proposed in the 1980s. But he sort of helped me understand where to find them in the writings of the present, the 1990s and 2000s, and navigate my way between the new leftism, which is still kind of where I locate myself in the region, but also with the writings of the late 1970s and early 1980s. And so his book, Unconquerable World, was one of the ways. I mean, first he told me about it in the way that people do, and then I went and read it. But it was really in him telling me about it in kind of a discursive format that brought me to this understanding. And I wouldn't have been able to finish the book without it, because I was so politically torn about it's such a different person than when I started, which is what happens if you take too long to finish your book, is you change, right? So that happened. And so because of that, I was really stuck, you know, looking for a reason not to finish it, but also stuck. And he helped me figure out how to relate my current self to the person I had been raised by these 68ers intellectually in the 1990s. So thank you, Jonathan. A great man. That's him. Yeah. I mean, there are many other people that could have been there, but he happened to come along at the right moment.
Okay, yeah, so here she is, Jessie Labov, the Transatlantic Central European, and a person who will continue to change in the decades to come, and we will all benefit from it. So that said, I'm leaving the floor for questions. So I think I'm passing the mic on to Petra so she can moderate the discussion. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much for this inspiring conversation. And I think Honza Matonoha has a question, so let's continue in the discussion. Just turn your microphone on.
Sorry, I'm sorry for the mishap. I don't mean to jump ahead of anyone who is eager to ask any questions, but if should there be anyone else, I'm eager to ask 2 or 3 questions myself. Thanks very much for a brilliant presentation. I'm eager to read the book. I have to write a review, which I should have, and I should have been much more aware of that in Czech. I'm very much pleased, and but at the same time, I have one minor hesitation, which might be explained or accounted away by the fact that you focus on 80s and early 90s. But I mean, if you write, well, I mean, the book is about Transatlantic Central Europe, and the transatlantic needs to be emphasized and stressed out. I understand. But at the same time, I mean, and there might be a number of huge crowd of names could be mentioned and listed. But I mean, just browsing through the index of your book, I just didn't find names like Ivo Andrić or Sandro Marai or Bruno Schulz or Italo Svevo and most of all, given the fact that you say that, I mean, expulsion of Jews and extermination camps, the final solution, so-called final solution of a Jewish question is the kind of the stepping point of the book. I didn't find the name Imre Kertész there in the index. Ivo Andrić is not there. I mean, but which might be, again, as I mentioned, could be not accounted by the fact that their focus is completely elsewhere. I mean, in time-wise, and also I didn't find names like Helmut von Moltke or Theodor Herzl or Elmar Mahler-Werfer or Seton Watson or whatever, whomever you want to. I mean, the list might go on and on and on. So my question is why my basic question is why there is not why Kertész is not there, is not present in the book. Then the second question, which is and the further one, which is built up on the one on the other, is that I mean, Central Europe. I mean, I'm sorry, I was late. I just by complete mishap, I just tried to join a different conversation, and but so you might have mentioned it in the meanwhile. But I mean, Central Europe seems to be kind of I mean, defined by first the presence of the Habsburg monarchy, obviously, and then perhaps maybe in the second more closely to our presence in the 80s, Lisbon conference, for instance, the essay by Milan Kundera you wrote quite so extensively. I'm so much looking forward to read it through. So I wonder why Central Europe now? I mean, apart from the fact that Soros and Soros and the issue. I mean, maybe trying to kind of go against the Orban and moving Central European University being moved. I mean, forced to move from Budapest to Vienna, if I understand correctly, and so on. So apart from fighting this kind of nationalistic kind of these strange movements, why Central Europe now? And the last question is if you can account for, I mean, or if you can say in few words why Yugoslav war is so crucial for your understanding. Apart from, I mean, my instinct would be that it might do something with the loss of network and loss of nationalism being given preference to against over multinationalism or plural kind of pluralistic identity. So why Yugoslavia is so important? I mean, why Yugoslavia in mid-90s and the Yugoslav war is so important for you. Thank you.
Okay, this is actually really helpful. I'll try to do a quick answer to each. I think I can, especially if I avoid the second question quite explicitly. And maybe I'll just start by saying how I framed the book, which will help you understand why the sort of canon of Central European authors aren't there. So the first thing I should say is it's not a book about fiction. I certainly read all of those authors and teach them, and I've written on 2 of them, but I didn't ever come up with this project as a kind of a survey of Central European fiction. Instead, it's one layer removed, so it's a kind of a meta conversation about conversations in the journal. Now, in Cross Currents, you do have articles about each of these authors, quite a few about Andrić, in fact. He becomes kind of like a touchstone. And I could have done a project, a version of this project, which dealt specifically with how Andrich is addressed and what his meaning is for the 1980s Central European essayists. But in fact, the object of scrutiny is not the novel, but the essay. And it can be the essay about a novel, or it can be an essay about a geopolitical formation, or it can be an essay about an intellectual tradition. So all of those authors are in the journal, but not so much Moray. He really is not a part of this canon. Not so much Kertész, because he wasn't really he wasn't in the sights of this crew at that time. Now he would be. So that might help you understand. And in terms of the people who've written on different concepts of Central Europe, there is the absolute compulsory literature review, and I do talk a little bit about different versions of the concept, but I work pretty hard to get away from that quickly because I don't want to debate what it is. What I want to talk about is how it was described by these essayists in this particular historical and geographic context. So my version of Central Europe, when people always ask me what's in it, what's not, it's like, well, ask Miłosz, ask Kundera, and ask Danilo Kish, who has the most broad and encyclopedic version. It really is what those thinkers understood it to be. So it's kind of a cheap answer, like, well, don't blame me, blame them. But what I actually mean is that that's not the project of the book to explain what it is. The project of the book is to explain what they thought it was and why. So about what it means today and the possible relationship of this term and this concept in political formations like Central European University, I can come back to that if you like, having been directly involved in that conversation. But I think the really simple and easy answer is that it still is associated as a term, as a concept, as an institution, Central European University, with some of these values that people were proposing were attached to the concept in the 1980s. And there are particular pieces of that liberal humanist project which are threatening to illiberal governments today. Is that the whole reason why CE was kicked out? No, but discursively it could be one of them. And the last question, I can get into this in more detail if anybody's interested. There are three ways in which Yugoslavia becomes the focus of this project. The first, again, following the trajectory of the journal. In the beginning of the journal, one of the major tropes and moments of identification is with Jewish culture. It was a lost identity, even by non-Jews writing around this time. But as the years go by, when we get to the early 1990s, and the journal continues until 1994, just to give you a framework. That was where I kind of ended the project as I understood it. Yugoslavia becomes the main topos in the journal. So it's not me, it's their framing, and it becomes, in fact, a thematic point over and over again, not just by Yugoslav writers or ex-Yugoslav writers, but by everybody trying to understand what's happening intellectually, culturally, personally. The second way I talk about it is to try to deal with the question of North-South divide. And I'm responding here to Maria Todorova very much, who sees the Central Europeans as kind of like this Visegrad elite, and they cut themselves off from Southeast. And so I argue very much with that. And I mean, they're not all very nice guys, and they have some really grumpy opinions, but one thing they did not want to do was cut themselves off from Yugoslavia and what it meant. And so I put Danilo Kish is kind of the person that represents the over-identification with Yugoslavia as not just a part of the Central European concept, but actually at the heart of it. And the last way I do, and this is just so you know it's in there, and I don't know that it was a great idea to include this, but I'm really attached to this reading, is I look at the way that the language of human rights, and again, liberal humanist ideals, as represented by an organization like the Helsinki Foundation, were turned against themselves by people working on the ground, specifically in Yugoslavia in the late 1980s. And the examples I give are these human rights committees that formed to liberate Serbian minority actors in Kosovo. So I use that as a way to show how, this is what Piotr was referring to with the workaround, that some of these structures, and we can even call them kind of mechanisms, can be used, repurposed for other reasons. And the big question I ask is, or I try to answer is, how did people that were formerly understood as dissidents become nationalists? And I try to explain how that happened. It probably doesn't belong in this book, but I was working on it, so I stuck it in there. And there is a very broad reference to other themes of the book. Yeah, that's one of those things where I look at it now and think I should have just written an article and left it out. But there it is. It's in there.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you very much.
A lot of questions.
Any more questions?
We don't need any more. There was plenty of questions.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Well, if I may, I would like to ask whether you followed the response to the polemic of between Kundera and Brodsky about the very notion of Central Europe, and whether you think that there are still some intriguing points about this polemic up to the present day.
I could give you a really fun example. My husband refused, who's Hungarian, I need for context, refused out of principle to get the Sputnik vaccine. Like, I got it, but he wouldn't. And I was like, well, why not? I mean, do you not believe in science or what's... But it was the opportunity came up and he just refused. Because the idea of injecting himself with something that was so identified with Russia, he didn't give me a scientific reason for it. He said, like, culturally, it was untenable to him. So instead, he had to wait an extra couple of weeks and get his Pfizer shot. And this was the kind of attitude that Kundera had. It's almost like an allergic reaction to the cultural imprint, which is bullshit, right? Because if you look at Polish, Czech, Slovak, Hungarian, Yugoslav literature from a different point of view, you can see Russian literature in every crevice. It's not that there's no connection, and it's not that there's not Dostoevsky everywhere, but this attitude was about the rejection of a certain cultural affect. And I find that dramatic encounter in a couple other places between Ladislav Matejka and his master Roman Jakobson. I find it in this Lisbon conference, of course, the conversation. What's kind of fascinating to me is that maybe less so in some parts of the region than others, you still do find traces of it today in skepticisms and prejudices in kind of popular culture, in conspiracy theory, in the air. But my best example is my husband refusing to get the Sputnik vaccine. Like, just imagine, like you're in the middle of the ocean on a lifeboat, and there's a huge ocean liner there, and you wouldn't get on it. That's what it was like. So,
thank you.
Hope that wasn't too glib, but it was very real and very recent.
So, anyone else? If not questions, then remarks. Petra?
Sorry, thank you so much for the interview. I have just one question. I liked the insight into the Reading Cultura project, and I wonder, Jessie, if you could share with us your current or future projects in the field of digital humanities.
Oh, okay. I gotta think what those are. They change quite often. Thank you for the opportunity to pitch something big. Actually, I can share with you 3 possible ideas I'm working on, all of which are funding driven and funding dependent. Most of which are in collaboration with my dear friend Piotr here, right? And also with Tomáš Scheibner, those of you who know him. One is the same old Emigre project, but on a much broader scale, which is I'm working on now, as you have heard, at the Institute of Literary Studies, your analog in Hungary. If you didn't recognize the title of the Academy of Sciences, it's because they changed it, right? So we're now the Ipus Loran Research Network, but it's the same institution that Piotr is at in Poland and you are at. And there I'm working on, as you might expect, like tracing the pathways of Hungarian literature throughout the world. So like the Kultura project on steroids. And we have a couple of different ways we're doing it. I don't know which one I'm going to do yet. It depends on which one gets funded. But it's in collaboration with the Historical Institute. The other big project I've been trying to get off the ground for years is a Radio Free Europe related project based at the Open Society Archives, working on the telexes. So as you heard from Piotr and I talking about these workaround hacker things, like I'm a big media archaeology geek, and I got really fascinated by the telex system about 10 years ago. And I started to think about how it could be an amazing early illustration of a distributed network of communication. So if you want to know more about that, clearly you need to go read Piotr's book on Social Media. But it was, completely independently. Before I even knew he was taking that turn with his book, I came to the same general way of thinking about that telex thing. So that's the second project. And I don't remember what the third one is, but there was another one. These ideas come with grant proposals and disappear when they don't get funded. So ask me again in 6 months.
Okay, still time for one more question.
I have one on world literature and the macroscope too, but...
Oh, that's right. The macroscope. That one didn't even get proposed. That's the best idea ever. Yeah. That's the Balaton project. Yeah. But, well, maybe one day. In our retirement.
We had great time thinking about it.
Sometimes that's what matters.
Including night swimming, some of us.
Yeah. It doesn't really matter if the project gets funded. What matters is how much fun you have writing it. Yeah. It should be the model. Do you guys know Frederica Kindkovac at all? Some of you, maybe? She wrote on this Samizdat phenomenon quite a bit. She and I want to start a kind of an Institute for Advanced Studies style seminar in the hills around Balaton, in her barn. So stay tuned. It just, especially if COVID disappears and we lose all of our jobs and have no other way to support ourselves, we're definitely going to do it. So, in the barn. In the barn. It's beautiful. It's called Kapvalantoti. It's a beautiful little village nestled next to Balaton. So, but yeah, these are the kinds of projects like that we will carry out one day. If you just wait long enough for us to retire. So I think we've covered it. That's more than I ever meant to say by writing the book. And certainly it's because of Piotr's amazing questions and Jan, yours as well. Thank you for the extensive opportunities to respond.
Thank you very much.
I think we're good.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the serious. I hope all of it could be in English.